And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Specializing in Indigenous engagement, the core objective of Blackfish Group is to build partnerships that are meaningful and respectful between government, private sector, and Indigenous groups. On today's Open Connection, President of Blackfish Group, Chris Sankey.
One of the influencers I had in high school was my old high school coach, Mel Bishop, of the Prince of Rainmakers, and I thought, well, he'd always say, you work only 10 months a year, you work in the summers if you don't have a family yet, and enjoy your time off with family, so I thought I'll do that. And I realized that's not for me. I think for me, a lot of monotonous work I found, like there's a curriculum set for you that you got to teach. That's just my opinion. I'm not saying it's less important. It just wasn't for me. In fact, I didn't finish. I always felt like, I should go back and get my degree, and I never finished. I had these opportunities. I did go back eventually and worked in the HR arena, training to employment. Then I got into an opportunity to go to school at the University of Phoenix, but it wasn't long after where I actually got an opportunity to work in the oil and gas sector in the Fort McMurray area. So I had to really think about it. I didn't want to go back to school full time, and I was living in Vancouver at the time, and you only get these opportunities once in a lifetime, and I went to Fort McMurray, and that's where I learned the majority of my business and understanding what it means to run a business, and I have no regrets in doing that. So I got to work under a guy named Bill DeCaro for Tuckeroo Inc. group of companies, Dave Tuckeroo, who owns the companies, and I learned quite a bit under him, and that's really what moved me into the direction of getting into business. And it was help managing a part of a potable water and liquid waste contracting company. It's not always about the money, but our people, I found later on, they weren't necessarily against the project, they were against where the site was being proposed. And rightfully so, when you look at the mouth of the Skeena, it was a very contentious site, and it was quite a difficult decision to make. We had to weigh the pros and cons of that area, and of course there was a lot of scientists weighing in, there's a lot of NGOs, there was a lot of unfortunate circumstances that were taking place within our community, and it didn't go the way people probably would have hoped. I think lessons learned is moving forward. I think, what I took from that is I was able to understand a different perspective of our people. Even though we all want our people to get out of poverty, we all want our people to have good paying jobs, we all want them to have good affordable housing, good health care, good education. For our people, we've always lived on the land, and we've had no money and still took care of the land. And so that just reinforced what it means to be First Nations on the coast and First Nations in general in Canada, that no amount of money was going to sway people's minds. But that being said, when we did the voting on PNW, 70% were in favor, and I believe it was 15 to 20% were undecided, and the rest were a no, which was a smaller number. So we did that vote 3 times, right? And at the end of the day, those were the results. But market dictates everything, and at the end of the day, the markets weren't good, and the proponent, which was Petronas at the time, decided to pull the pin with market conditions. I was always doing some consulting work, working with Indigenous communities and industry players and with government. But I thought, well, what can we do differently next time? Something like that comes along. I want to see our people benefit. I want to see our people, our communities transform and be a part of Canada and not being apart from Canada. And I thought, well, what can I do now? So now I'm back in the whole private sector. I thought, well, I'm pretty good at doing Indigenous engagement, stakeholder relations, and government affairs. I'm pretty brash, I'm pretty blunt at times, and I think it's worked for me. I'm not saying it works for everybody. So I thought, what can I do differently? And so now here comes along reconciliation, Indigenous reconciliation, which is a national push for more Indigenous inclusion to have a greater seat and say at the table. And so now, now that I'm back into the private sector, I not only own the consultancy firm that I do work in the sector of Indigenous engagements, stakeholder relations and government affairs. I also now have a heavy civil company with 4 other partners, and as well as an energy company, as I mentioned. But at the end of the day, I thought, well, what can I do to help bring our communities together? And so I'd actually helped start the Tsimshian leadership table, which is actually now ongoing right now. I'm wishing them the best. I hope that that table continues on. And it was all the 7 Tsimshians to get together to talk about common interest, political risk, and a path forward.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thanks for staying with us. Indigenous people are sometimes thought to be outside the global economy and opposed to any and all development. Let us return to the conversation as Chris Sankey shares how he's creating a safe place for dialogue.
And if anything, to create dialogue amongst the leadership, whether it's concerns of overlap, how can we incorporate hereditary, how can we get the message to grassroots people around what opportunities there are in the territories, and respecting each other's boundaries. So I had initially got that started with one of the coastal leaders, and it was again to create a safe space for dialogue around natural resource sector, and it could be oil, it could be gas, it could be methanol, it could be hydrogen, as well as fisheries and forestry and all those other things that come with port-related developments. When you take a look at the transportation corridor, everything is focused on Western Canada now. When you look at the low carbon push, Prince Rupert is going to be the future of a low carbon port. So I thought, well, how can I help our people get around the table to have these discussions, not just the good discussions, but the good, the bad, the ugly. And I think the only way we're going to move forward as a people, we start having those tough discussions amongst ourselves, not just with industry, not just with government, but if we can't have these sit down across from one another and express what our concerns are, it's going to be really difficult to really truly get to reconciliation. We talk about reconciliation with government, we talk about reconciliation with industry, but no one's really talking about reconciling with each other amongst our communities. And I think it's important, whether it is just the Tsimshian starting now, or the Tsimshian creating dialogue with the Haida, creating dialogue with the Nisga'a, creating dialogue with the Haisla, and throughout the corridor. I really believe that our people still need to reconcile amongst ourselves, with not only in our communities, but with neighboring communities as well. Dave Johnston asked if I would like to participate in this leadership documentary with Chief Crystal Smith, the Haisla, and they wanted to know who else I could recommend from the East, and I recommended Chief Terry Paul, a member too. And I thought, well, this would be a great opportunity to really connect the dots and build relationships across the country. And there's many leaders out there that I felt that could be a part of a documentary like this. And the premise of the documentary is to talk about what strategy is working locally when we talk about economic development to create a local economy for our people, and then how can that strategy reach a further, nationally, how can that strategy help our communities nationally to ignite Indigenous communities across the country to get involved in the private sectors, to get our provinces and countries moving together. I really believe that the corridor, there's a unity corridor that I'm a part of, and the unity corridor is based upon how do we bridge all of the communities from Newfoundland to British Columbia up to Churchill, and how best can we get this thing going. It wasn't just about energy, it was about fiber optic, it was about the power grid. How can we fight climate change? What can we do to have a low carbon economy? What do we do in our part to raise the level of awareness of how important climate change is? And I felt this was the way to do it, and bringing our communities together. And it all starts with different parts and different regions amongst this country. And so what I did was I linked up with some business folks out in Alberta who said, we need to get something going here so that Indigenous people along the corridor have greater say, greater equity and participation to have local economies which will transform to a national economy. So the only way to start that is having a unity corridor where we can start to develop these relationships amongst our nations so we can sit down like this and start having real meaningful discussions about economic development. The pros, the cons, dispel any myths that are out there, whether it's in energy or else or other. And I thought, well, we need to have this discussion. Why isn't that First Nations in the Fort McMurray area and the area that has oil and gas having a conversation with First Nations on the coast? And that's the whole message I've been sending to people, that you have to sit down across from one another. You're never going to really know the true value or the true concerns within our community so we don't start having this dialogue. What I found in my travels is that even those that were opposed to development weren't necessarily opposed to development. They're opposed to the process that was being proposed. They want it on their terms. Now, whether they go forward or not is entirely up to the community. And part of my job in working with industry is to create dialogue. I've always said that I don't speak for industry. I'm industry myself. But what I do is I create that dialogue so that there's an opportunity for industry to have that conversation with First Nation leaders, whether it's on the coast, interior, or other provinces. That's what I do, help provide a strategy to get those relationships started and having a real conversation about what matters to their communities and how we could build the level of competency, build capacity in our communities, and start looking at all areas within our communities of where we need help at. It could be in finance, it could be administration, it could be in economic development. That's my whole purpose in what I do with Blackfish Enterprises, is helping communities hopefully bring capacity. But it has to start with dialogue, and you have to sit down across from one another to have those conversations, real meaningful conversations, and never be afraid to shy away from tough topics. The reality is there's some tough issues out there. One of them is Bill C-48, the other one's Bill C-15. UNDRIP, what does this look like for all of us? And we got to have those discussions in order to move forward.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. The term protocol means many things, but overall it refers to the way of interacting with Indigenous people in a manner that respects traditional ways of being. Let us return to the conversation as Chris shares how he helps with this process.
What works in Alberta doesn't work in British Columbia. What works in the interior doesn't work on the coast. You have to understand and respect the process and protocols that each of these nations have. And so my job is to help guide industry to making sure that they know who they're going to speak to first and who's the point of contact when you're speaking with communities. Some people like it to be the elected First Nation chief first, or they like it to be their dev first, or maybe they have a group of a smaller executive team around the business developers to get the information first to see whether or not this is a tangible opportunity, and then they provide that information to leadership. And some just like going directly to leadership to start that dialogue. I think it's really important to understand your audience before you walk into anywhere to start talking business. One of the things that we're really good at, Indigenous people, is storytelling. And so when you're coming to meet First Nations people, you don't just start talking about business right off the bat. This is about developing a relationship. Get to understand who we are. Get to understand the audience you're in front of. Get to know who the aunts and uncles are who are in the back room, and build that relationship so you could start to build trust. And that doesn't happen overnight. That takes time. Indigenous communities, for the first time in the history of Canada, has an opportunity to be a partner, a meaningful partner, to have a seat in the say, with not just tokenism, with real equity, a real seat in the say to dictate how their future is going to be. We talk about, everybody throws around this sovereign wealth. Well, sovereign wealth has to start from somewhere, and it's got to start with us to really look at the opportunities around the resource development. Because when you take a look at fisheries or forestry or tech or farming or agriculture and aquaculture, none of those are possible without the energy industry. And everybody talks about how we got to eliminate oil and gas. Well, that's not possible. It's just not possible. how we feed power to the metropolitan areas. We're talking millions of people, billions around the world. We got to get the energy from somewhere. And so why not get it right here at home, where First Nations could dictate and control the outcomes of these economic opportunities for the betterment of their communities. So we need to be able to be realistic about this. Like, I want to be able to relay that to our youth about what does energy actually mean? What does it actually mean to do this transition that everyone's talking about, to have a green economy? Well, it's not about just cutting off oil and gas or propane or whatever it may be around the energy sector that requires liquid. It's about understanding the transformation of how we could start to utilize the green energy sector to complement the oil and gas sector when we're talking about reduction in GHG. But no one ever hears that the companies are doing low carbon capture. A lot of them now looking at blue and green hydrogen. No one's talking about what they're doing around safety. All those things you never hear in the media. Well, I'm blessed to be a part of all that. I know what industry is doing. And so what I'm trying to do is inform Indigenous communities what's actually taking place in our industry, so they have a better opportunity to respond and get informed, to give informed information to our people, but as well as speak to the facts. There's a lot of misleading information out there pertaining to the energy sector and where it actually comes and how it's extracted. So there's a lot of things I believe, which I do know of, that are very misleading to the general public. Lastly, you had mentioned about how that First Nations, are we all on the same page when industry comes to the table? No, but what I can tell you is that along my experience is that there are more Indigenous people in favor of resource development than not. And so you never hear that in mainstream media. All you hear is the no's and no, we're against this, we're against that. That's not true. First Nations people want to see responsible resource development, but they want to see it on their terms. And they also have to have skin in the game. They got to be able to have a seat in the say. You know, as I always tell industry, like long after these projects go or remediation starts to take place, it's our people that will be here for the next 10,000 years, just as we were prior to that for the last 10,000 years. I always say to people that, you know, we've been in business for the last 10,000 years. You talk about people that have transient people in this world, well, we're not one of them. You know, when we talk about the colonial system that came into Canada and you look how that all started, we're the same people that have never left their lands. So you have to think about 7 generations ahead about how we're going to look at it when we view resource development in our territories, that this has got to be on our terms. And so never before in history in Canada have I ever seen such importance of Indigenous inclusion. Now's the time to take advantage of that. Now's the time to have a seat in the say and dictate how you want to see your future for not only just your kids, for your community, but for your grandkids and for the next 7 generations.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Alberta and British Columbia have roughly the same amount of natural gas resources. Alberta's petrochemical and chemical industry produces over $9.5 billion worth of products annually. In this final segment of Open Connection, Chris shares what he sees in store for the Northwest.
When you take a look at a petrochemical plant, people need to understand what that actually means. So it means goods and services that are going to be manufactured out of those plants to help us live with everyday. It could be your coat, it could be your cell phone, it could be your pen, it could be a piece of equipment for your dryer, your truck, your home. Those are things that could be manufactured here in the Pacific Northwest. We have all this land in the Pacific Northwest that could be utilized. When you talk about trades, the trade opportunity with Southeast Asia is now. And with the Port of Prince Rupert and the Port of Kitimat, we have all these opportunities to move goods and services through those 2 ports. Like I said, Prince Rupert's port is going to expand. But when you talk about our fish plant, which is now called the fish plant, it's still in an isolated situation because there's no road to go through yet, and it's very expensive to get product out. The last couple of years before I left council, salmon season hasn't been so good, so they focused on ground fish, and that's where their bread and butter was. I think they could diversify, but the challenge for Lakwalams is just logistics. And I think it's in a prime spot for opportunity for more fishermen to come, but with no access road where transportation corridor could go to and from without catching a ferry, it's extremely difficult to make a go of it when their logistics are your hindrance, which is the big piece to getting product out of the community in a cost-effective way. And with that, you're going to add added costs by getting onto a ferry. So whether it's a barge, a truck, or a ferry, it's just added cost. So then every time you touch your product, it's more cost for you to get it going. But they've had a few good years there. I always wish my community the best. My mom worked there. My late mom worked there when I grew up there, and it was a very communal place to work. It's a lot of fun. There's some really good people there that has made life easier working there, and I really respect the people that have really dedicated their lives to providing opportunities such as jobs in the fish plant there. But it's seasonal, and then after that, what do you do? So, there's a lot of people that are working in Prince Rupert right now, but there's still a lot of people within our communities that don't want to be able to maintain two homes, where they have a home in the community and then they got to look for a condo or somewhere else to live in Prince Rupert. And of course, with the housing market today, it's going to be virtually impossible for our people to do that. One, they need the proper income to do that, and two, they got to be able to get into the market. And so that's just not possible for many of our people. So how do we bring these opportunities, not just to communities like mine, but all these other communities that want to have an equal opportunity for economic development? When I take a look at this corridor and you see all the people that want to see their people do well, it all comes down to opportunity. And for Lac Ouellam's, we've been pretty blessed in terms of the vicinity of where we're situated, and we have 18,000 square kilometers of rights and title land, and we've got fee simple land. And a lot of the communities outside of that don't have that opportunity. So how do we help those other communities take advantage of global economic opportunities? And that's something that the leaders have to sit down and have that discussion about. Not myself, as I'm not elected anymore, but how can they have that discussion so that we could help those people, that those communities that want a chance at economic opportunities, so they could bring their people out of poverty in some of the areas that they're in. Reconciliation is about exploring these opportunities, and I think that Indigenous communities need to understand that in order for us to move forward, we got to work together. And I've always said that together we're stronger. But at the same time, you don't always have to agree with one another. We could sit down and have these discussions without yelling at each other because you may disagree with the project. But you have to also understand that some of our leaders are on insurmountable pressure to bring opportunities. And so if they're going to look at oil, or if they're going to look at gas, or they're going to look at hydrogen, if they're going to look at port-related developments, you have to understand that those are opportunities for people that they're trying to get and lift out of poverty, to raise the level of opportunity within our backyard. I mean, we got to be competitive in our backyard and never be afraid to talk about money, because money's never going to make you happy, but I tell you, it helps you out with a lot of things when you have it. And so if we could look at things and think locally, think globally, but act locally, I think our communities can be in a very strong position for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years, because never before I've ever seen a greater opportunity for First Nations communities to get involved in global economics. Together we're always stronger, as I always say.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our majesty within. I'm Robert Picktown.